Okay, so tonight we're talking about React again. This is part 2 of a 3-part series on React. That's just an introduction. You guys are just learning the basics, but it's good. It's good foundational stuff. I'll give some announcements and then we'll go into lecture and then you will go into the studio for this chapter. So graded assignments. This has been Colin's, mantra every class that all of graded assignments have to be in by midnight, graded, demoed, and graded. And you have to have, a full 1.0 on every assignment by midnight on Monday the 14th in order to get into Unit 2. So make sure you're attending those office hours with your TAs, getting help during studio time when you can, and scheduling those demos and getting them knocked out as early as possible. I will have a video coming soon to cover the introduction to graded assignment 6. I know some of you have already started on it. That's okay. But I'll get that up soon. And then you guys will have a little bit more orientation to it and know what to expect. As far as I know, the only meetup scheduled right now is in Kansas City for tomorrow evening from 6 to 8. So Philly and St. Louis folks, hang in there. Hopefully another one's coming up soon. All right. Let's do React part 2. So we're going to talk about just rendering basic JavaScript variables and expressions. You've already seen this modeled before. I did some of this last class. Excuse me, let me go back there. We'll talk about conditional rendering and looping using the map method that we talked about a couple classes ago. And then how to detect events and then actually handle them because that's done a little bit differently in React than it was in the DOM. And then we'll talk about styled components. Now this is bonus material. Styled components is a library used to handle CSS right there in your file. It's super awesome. I mentioned it last class. And I decided to go ahead and incorporate it so that you guys can see an example of it used. Don't freak out if you don't feel like you have to learn it, if you don't want to, because it's definitely something I did not learn until I was on the job. But I wanted to go ahead and get into it a little bit just so you can see what some of the other options are. And then when I get done covering all of that, we will actually do some more live coding, but I'm really going to be kind of just going through basic examples on the slides for a while. And then after the break, we'll talk about the styled components, and then I'll start doing all the live coding, and we will continue on that garden planning tool app that we started on last time. Okay, so let's talk about variables and expressions in JavaScript. You can evaluate JavaScript within JSX pretty simply. You just use the curly braces as a placeholder in JSX, and then place the variable or a function call that returns some sort of value. Maybe it's a Boolean expression. There can be some other things. We're going to get lots of practice with this tonight. So here's an example where I have a simple helper function I've written that just is to get the today's date and then just get the year from that, the 4-digit year. So I have this function get year, goes and gets new date, which returns by default returns today's date. And then it goes and gets the year from that. So I'm going to make a call from that here as part of my copyright component that I've created here and place that right there using that placeholder as part of the text between the p tags. And then I'm going to do it again using the prop this time that I've, in passing down into this component where I have the author's name. And so there's, 2 different ways that I'm receiving data in 2 different ways, but using that same placeholder syntax to put it right there in the JSX. And then, of course, when you see it on the page, you would get the copyright symbol instead of that HTML entity. And then you'd get the year, and then you'd have the author's name. All 3 of those would be rendered out onto the page as regular text. So to see kind of the other side of that, you can use template literals when circumstances call for it. If you want to combine texts and variables or expression, you know how to use template literals. You've been doing that for a long time with JavaScript. But the key is that in certain circumstances, you might need to place them inside a JSX placeholder first so that you can evaluate that entire thing as JavaScript. So here's an example of that. I'm using the backticks inside the curly braces of the JSX placeholder. And then I've got two different JavaScript placeholders with the $sign because I'm taking, the first name and a last name, and I'm putting them all together as part of that template literal, evaluating that, and then that value is the value of that prop author that's going into that copyright component that I had defined on the previous slide. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about conditional rendering. There are lots of different ways to do this. This is the most kind of classic way, just using a regular JavaScript logic, right? If and else if and else. So if you have two or more alternative blocks of JSX that you could return, you could set it up this way. Like, let's say you've got some sort of variable that's tracking the loading of the page, and you're waiting for the page to load. And as long as it hasn't loaded, you want to just return that text that says loading. And then once it does return, you have to see, well, did I get the data I was looking for, or is the data empty? And if there isn't data, then I would say, there's no results to display. But if there is data, then I would want to actually use my results. Maybe I've got this results component, and I'm going to pass that data into the component with the search results prop. And so I only want to actually render that if those other two things are not true first. This would be one way to set it up. So in this case, you're using the if else, structures, and having three different return keywords because you're only returning one or the other because they're all mutually exclusive. And then they each have their own, value being returned. It's the JSX there. So that would be, a very straightforward way of doing it. It's the way that's modeled the most in your textbook. There's also the option of doing a ternary operator. We talked a little bit about a ternary in general, just in terms of how it works in JavaScript in class 17. And so here's what it looks like when you're using it with JSX. You might have only two possible outcomes. This is a great way to do this. So you might say, okay, maybe in this case, I'm not worried about the loading versus loading, or I'm handling that elsewhere. And this is just one other little part. I would say, let's just go look and see if the data is there. Now, remember that even if data is not a Boolean, like let's say that represents an array of objects of data, right? That maybe it was fetched from some API, you've got JSON. And so you're just making sure it's there. And you're saying, if the data is there, then it's going to evaluate, it's going to be truthy and evaluate to true. If it's not there, or if it's like an empty array, it'll evaluate to false. So that's how you can kind of use this as a Boolean expression. And you say, is it there? Great, let's show the results, component and, pass in that data for the search results prop. But if it's not, on the other side of the colon here, we would say there's no results to display. So it's just a binary choice, true or false. If it's long, if you have multiple lines, then you can do it in a different way by, kind of putting it out on separate lines like this. And that's one way that you might see sometimes it gets automatically formatted if you are using a formatter like Prettier or something like that. But again, there's a single return, right? You say return, and then you just have your two options handled by that ternary operator syntax with the question mark and the colon. Okay. So a third option for conditional rendering is, what if you just want to say, maybe I want to hide something. Maybe I don't always want something to show necessarily. So if you're basically saying either show this or don't show this, a great way to do this, and something that the pros use all the time, is the logical and operator. And the way that you would read this, used this way, is if this first thing is true, and then you have the and operator, then display this. So this is how you use it with JSX. So it won't render unless that first thing evaluates to true. And if you have this worked in among other JSX elements, like I'm showing you right here, you have to enclose it in a JSX placeholder so it can evaluate it as JavaScript. So let's look at this example. We've got, let's say we're creating this blog post and we're passing a bunch of props in. So I'm going to deconstruct those so I can call them each by name. So I'm going to say, let's get the title prop, the subtitle prop, the paragraphs prop, and we'll pull all those out. And now we can go ahead and return the entire blog post and format it the way we want to. And so I can start with, maybe I've got this title component and I just pass in what that title is. And then I've got a subtitle component, but maybe subtitle is something they chose to leave blank. Maybe they didn't want a subtitle for this particular blog post. In that case, I could just say, if subtitle exists, then render it. And then by default, if this evaluates to false, it won't be rendered. But the entire thing is enclosed in those curly braces because it has to evaluate it as a JavaScript expression. And then after that, maybe there's another component for the content that's, just the paragraphs, and maybe you have that copyright one I had earlier where you're passing in the user's name as the author. And then it can render all of that together exactly how those components define them. But this is how, this is kind of how we would do that to basically just say either hide it or show it, depending on whether subtitle exists. And again, this is that faulty, truthy type thing of saying, if it's an empty string or if it's null, it's going to evaluate to false. And then that whole line won't even render at all. Okay, we are going to get to some examples of this eventually with the live coding. But again, I'm going to do that at the very end because I'm not going to be adding things in the same order that I'm teaching them to you right now. So we'll wait until we get through all of that. But there's that logical and operator that you see underlined in yellow there. That's the key right there. All right, one more thing about conditional rendering. You can have conditional styling with classes. This is very helpful. And it's especially easy to do with these shortcuts. So let's say I kind of had something similar to this in class 17. Let's say you have an account balance, but it's a React component, and you're passing in an amount as a prop. So we'll say, let's define this, Boolean value here is below 0, and we're just going to evaluate that as props.amount is less than 0. If it's below 0, then this will be true, otherwise it'll be false. We can return this JSX, we can have our title component, pass in that text account balance, and then we can have, a single paragraph, but we can set the class differently depending on whether is below 0 is true or false. So we would just ask, is below 0? And if it is, we'll have that be red text. And if not, we'll add green text. And then we would have these classes defined elsewhere. In this case, they would probably be defined, in a global file like index.css or app.css. And it would, go ahead and just choose whichever one is appropriate. And then that props.amount that's actually being rendered as the value is going to be either red or green, depending on whether this is true or false. That's a pretty classic way to handle this type of logic for adding a class conditionally, so that you can make things very easily say, it's going to be one color or the other, and this is what defines it. So again, there's that ternary operator with the question mark and the colon. That's super great shorthand. Okay, I don't actually have a questions slide here, but I know I just talked about several different things. So let me take questions real fast and then I'll continue going. We'll talk about looping. Does anybody have any questions at this point? Brittany?
Hi, can you go back to the slide with the logical and that you were just on?
Sure.
I have a question, and I know you talked about this a little bit last class. It's with the props. So when you're doing this deconstruction here with the title, subtitle, and paragraphs and the props,
yeah,
why do we not just pass in those parameters in like the function instead of doing props and then deconstructing it? Why do we not just do like subtitle, title, paragraphs there?
React. So because you're not passing them into a function, you're passing them into a component using attributes, right? So we would set this blog post component up as like a custom element when we're going to use it. And we would have several props. We'd have title equals with some value, and subtitle equals with some value, and paragraphs equals with some value. And all of those attributes would be listed separately on the element itself when we're placing the component. So what React does for you is it wraps them all up in an object called props. And then on this definition side, this is how you can get back to them. So the only reason I deconstructed them is so that I didn't have to say props.title, props.subtitle, props.paragraphs. By doing it this way, I can access them directly by name because I'm pulling them out of that object by their key name. So it's a much more straightforward way to keep track of what props there are when you're using it in some other file somewhere. But you've got them listed out right there in the definition.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, because otherwise it can be a little abstract. You don't always know what props are necessarily available. So I'm a fan of doing it this way. Madeline?
I think I know the answer to this question, but I just wanted to make it explicit. In copyright author, is user an object that you would have defined outside of the function? Okay, like more like a global object, or is that what you would call it?
Yeah, it might be something like, in most cases, it would be something you'd have coming from a store somewhere, like if you're running with Redux or something, where it's available by virtue of the fact that that user is logged in and you have access to their information. So you can, so yeah, I did not define it here explicitly. Otherwise, if you had to, define it, it would be defined, like, up above or something. But yeah, that's what's going on there. But I try to walk a line here where I'm giving you guys realistic examples, and that is absolutely how you'd be doing that. Sometimes you're going to be using information that's just available, from something else, other data that's coming in from somewhere else. Yep, you got it. Okay, all right, so let me skip back past this slide. Let's talk about map. Okay, so we talked about map in class 17 as a general, this is something that is in more modern JavaScript, right? So let's talk about how to use this with JSX, because it is 100% the way to go for creating multiple copies of the same JSX so that you can have a series of instances of it for unique values. So you've got an array of data. You want to have a JSX that uses each of the objects in that array. And every single one has different values, but they're structured the same. You've got all the same keys and values and things, generally speaking. So you can loop through. You want to store the mapped JSX in a const. And then you want to use that map method on the array and give that, and of course, it takes this anonymous function, right? So I'm going to use an arrow function, and you could just have one parameter under certain circumstances. You could just say, oh, I just want the result, right? Or, whatever it is, the element of the array. And then I'm going to operate on that each one. But when you're using JSX, React is going to require you to have a key attribute so that it can keep track of them individually and has to be unique. So because of that, you want to take advantage of the fact that map gives you a second parameter, which is the index, and it'll provide the index for you. So even though you're not doing, the old-fashioned classic for loop, where you have to have, a local variable called I as an iterator to keep track of that index, it still has it available to you. So you just pull it out as a second parameter like this. And then you can apply that as the key because it will be unique for each one. And then you can just return the JSX. You have to make sure you have that return keyword if you have multiple lines. Now with an arrow function, if you don't have brackets because you just have a single line and it's super simple, then you don't need the return keyword. But if you have brackets and you've got this set up, with multiple lines like this, you're going to have to use the return. Otherwise, nothing is coming back every single time this anonymous function gets called for each element in the array. So that's important. So make sure you return it, and then just set up the JSX with the key on the parent, element, whatever that is. and then use the data that comes from that particular object that it's on every single time it loops. So let's say I've got an array of results, whatever that means. Some sort of data, I went and did a search, I've got some results, and I've got a title and a description. I can actually, use that information and pull it right out by saying just result.title, result.description. And then every single one of these will have unique information because it'll be new for each new element that it's mapping over. And then all of that gets returned and stored in this constant here, results JSX, as all of those in order. And then you can just go down and place it wherever you need to return it as part of the JSX is returned from the function you're actually in, which in this case is a results section component that I'm creating that shall have, all the results together. So again, there's that array and method. I'm taking the data that's coming in, results, which I, would have somewhere else in this file where I'm grabbing it, and then map through each object in the array, which I'm calling result. Use that element and its index to then apply the key. And then, of course, all of that is being stored in this results JSX variable that I can then display all at once by placing it using a placeholder down there. And every single instance of that div is going to just be repeated one after another for every single element that was in the array. This will be more helpful to see how this works when I demonstrate it for you in a little bit, so hang tight. But this is the syntax, and that's the kind of the way you think through it. So we're going to talk about events and handlers real quick. We're not going to do a ton with this today because we haven't talked about state and life cycles yet. That's something that we'll be doing in part 3 on Thursday. But I wanted to at least cover the basic concept of it first, so that when we really build on it next time, this will already be somewhat familiar to you. And you are going to do a little bit of this for your studio tonight too. So when you are handling events, it's not like it is in the DOM where you have to go and like add event listeners and do this whole thing. You can actually just put these attributes directly on the element that you want to listen to. And with the DOM, if you were doing this in your HTML file, you would use the lowercase, kind of on click. But because this is JSX, you need to use the JavaScript camel case. So it would be on click with a capital C, for example. And this could be, any of all of the different, events that are out there for the user interacting with the page. But click is a super common one. So we'll go with that one for now. The value should just be a reference to a handler function that you've defined separately, usually. And then any code you want to execute when that event happens, it just goes inside that handler. And then it's very common convention to start the name of your handler with the word handle, handle click or handle change, or handle submit. Or sometimes you have to be more specific. Maybe you've got multiple buttons on your page, a cancel button and a submit button. So you might say handle submit, handle cancel. You can just kind of be as specific as you need to be, depending on how many handlers you've got on your in your file. So this is the common way to do it. So you can kind of see in this example here. First of all, we've got this JSX event name. So I've put on the button on click. And then I said, I want to have this handler called handle click. And I'm going to reference it. I'm not calling it. I'm referencing it, just giving the name as part of that, as the value of that attribute on click. And then up above where I've actually defined handle click, I'm just, I've got an anonymous function here as an arrow function. And I'm just for now console logging something just to prove that it works. Every time we click, we should see this in the console. That's all we're going to do for tonight. And then we'll actually see next time how we can affect changes on the page with it. But this is very straightforward. And it's all, kind of all in one place. You can see what you're doing right there. You just have to scroll up a tiny bit to see your handlers. Very, very common way to do this with React. Okay. Are there any more questions about the things I just talked about? No? Okay, that's fine. We're going to take our break now because when we come back, we're going to have a lot to unpack. I'm going to talk about style components, and then we're going to get into the live coding, and I'm going to demonstrate all of this, and I'm sure you'll have lots of questions after that. Okay, so let's take a quick break, and then we'll come back for the rest. Okay, welcome back. So as I mentioned at the beginning, this is not something that is in your book. It is not something that you're required to learn right now, but I'm going to cover it anyway, in case those of you who really want to latch onto it will know how it works. And I'm going to use it in my examples from here on out. This is a really great way to use CSS with React, with JSX. So styled components is a library that someone else created out there. There's actually some documentation here that you can go and read about how to use it, and all the different ways that it can be used, and what some of the special circumstances are. So I definitely, if you really want to dig into this, I recommend the docs. But you just install it as a dependency in your application when you're in your application directory, just by using npm install styled components. That's it. Boom, you've got it. So in order to use it, you just import it in any style, in any library. Wow, let me start that over. You just import it in any file, any JavaScript file that you need it in. So you can see here at the top, I've got import styled from styled components. That's it. It's that simple. And once you have that, you can start using it. So you define a custom element that essentially, it literally is a component that is styled, but you can just, you have a little bit of special syntax, but you just are saying, I've got this HTML tag, or I've got this React component that I just want to add a little bit of CSS to before I place it down in the returns JSX. And so you use backticks to enclose the CSS properties, those key value pairs. And then you can just use that component instead of whatever you were going to use originally. So in this example, you can see, I've imported the styled library, and then I've used it with the syntax where I've just said styled.a, and A is the HTML tag that I was planning to use for my link down below. But in this case, I want to style it with styled components. So I'm going to just name it up here instead. And then right after that, you immediately use that backtick and then use that to enclose all your CSS information. And so I've just got, I want this particular link to be, an anchor link, but I want it to be dark magenta. I want the font weight to be 700, and I want it to not be underlined by default. I want no text separation. So then down here, I say, okay, I named it link. So now that's what I use. And it looks an awful lot like you're placing a React component, right? It's got that same syntax with the capital L, but I'm using it just like I would if it were an A tag. I'm giving it the href attribute that the A tag takes. So it's just, it is an A tag. It's just dressed up a little bit, and you've given it a new name. So I have just placed that in line, and you'll see that, I just used it like I normally would an A. But I just used the word link instead, because I've, tacked on all of this CSS to it right here. And you typically do this outside, like I made this look like this is like all inside a component. It's actually not. You actually want to define this outside of your component, because then it doesn't run every time the component re-renders. We'll talk about that a little bit more when we talk about life cycles next class. But this is the syntax anyway, as much as I could fit on a slide. So let's look at another example. What if you have a React component that you want to add a little bit of extra styling to just this once in this one particular file? You can do it the same way, but you use parentheses instead of the dot notation with the styled here. So I say styled, and in parentheses, I give it the button component that I have imported here from another file. And I just say, I want to use the button as is, how it's defined in this other file, but I want to add a little bit of a margin to the left in it, because in this particular case, I want to put it right next to something, but I don't want it to be like butted right up next to it. Everywhere else I'm using it, this is not a problem, but in this particular file, I just need to add a little bit extra CSS. So I can do that. And in this case, the common convention would be to use the word styled in front of it, because they can't have the same name. So ordinarily, maybe I would place my button component here, but now I'm going to place styled button instead, because I added the CSS to it. And then it will be the original button component with all of its functionality, how it's defined in another file, but it also will have a margin on the left of 10 pixels. So again, there's the library that's imported from styled components. There's the React component that I imported from another file. And I'm saying I just want to add a little bit of CSS to this other component. And then I gave it a name styled button, and I used it below that way when I placed it in my return statement. Okay, so let's go over and do a whole bunch of coding. And we're going to, you're going to see examples of all of these things that I just taught you about in all these slides that we just went through. So the very first thing, I'm going to start with the styled components because I've already placed it. You'll notice I no longer have module files for header and available plant like we had last time. Actually, before we get started on the coding, let me orient you to the starter code for this class because I've added quite a lot of things to get the ball rolling for what we're going to do today since you saw this last. Now I've already got it spun up here. I've got a split terminal here. I used the little split terminal button. And on the left, I've got it, I did the npm start to get it up and running. On the right, I'm handling my, mostly I've got this just for handling Git commits. So it's up and running. I've got it in the browser right here. It looks just like it did where we left off last class, but there's some other stuff, some other files I've added. So I've got additional components that we're going to be filling out here, selected plant and flower bed. And I've got a whole bunch of to-dos all over the place to help us through all of that. And then I've got this shared folder that I added here alongside assets and components that has this utils file that just has a couple of helper functions. They're just straight JavaScript to help us with some things. We're going to make use of this capitalized one in a little bit. We'll probably use the alphabetized one next class, but I went ahead and put it in there for now. So there's that. So let's take a look at this. I also updated my test data to look a little bit more like the JSON that we're going to be using, but we're not going to use it as JSON until next class, because we're actually going to fetch it. I'm going to show you how to do that. And we can't really handle the asynchronous nature of fetching until you guys know how to handle state. And so we're going to have to do that next class. So for now, I just have it as test data like I did last time, but I added a couple things. One, my images are now on Google Drive, so I have links to those. And then I also added another property called num allocated. So we have a difference between the number that's available and the number that we've allocated to a flower bed. And so we're going to kind of use this dummy data to mock up what the page is going to look like. And once we kind of get it on the page, I'll be able to talk about, it'll be more obvious to you to be able to explain where it is that we're going with it, so that we can have more functionality next class when we finish it up. So we have quite a lot of things to do in the meantime, though, the things that we can do with the things that we talked about today. So number one, and by the way, if you haven't figured this out yet, and I think I may have showed you this before, but there's this great search tool over here. I mean, anytime you're in a file and you want to search for something in that file, you can do like Control F or Command F to find, like I can find the word component, anywhere in this file, and it tells you there's, 2 or 6 of them, and you can go through and find them, and that's great. But you can also do that with this over here, which is, kind of the global search, and it'll find things anywhere they exist. Now, components can yield a lot of results. So let me go for to-do, and now we can see that I've got to-dos in all of these different files. This is what I do professionally. I set to-dos for myself while I'm in development, and I put them in all of the different files where I know I'm going to need to add code as I'm updating something. And then I just, attack them one at a time. And as I get them done, I make them disappear and then, keep going. And that keeps me on task. It helps me to do things in the right sequence, and it helps me see how much I still have left to do. So we're going to start here with to-do number 1. It just says use styled components instead of the CSS module. So if you see here, I still have this module left over from before that had, something for main, had these IDs, left column and right column. And in here, I have this imported as styles from main.module.css. And this is how it's been demonstrated for you so far. And so the code still reflects this. I still just have, the main, and so it's taking its styling from that file. And then of course there was this div that's the, ID is that styles with left column. It's going and looking for it. And I have to use this bracket notation because it's hyphenated, which is classic CSS. And so we can do away with all of this by using styled components instead. So what I'm going to do is, I've already put the styled component definitions in here. I created a styled main. And the reason I had to call it that is because, and this is a little bit tricky, I'm not actually styling the main React component. I'm styling the lowercase main, but I still called it this. But main already exists, so I couldn't call it that. So I'm styling that main component. So I'm going to replace this with styled main like this. And then I have, of course, to do the closing tag as well. And now this is referencing this, and it's still main, but it's getting its CSS from here instead of getting it from here. So we're going to do the same thing with left column. Instead of having to have a div with an ID with, referencing all this and pulling it out of that other module, I can just say left call. Oops, I fixed that. There we go. And then fix the closing tag. And now it has the exact same styling, but it's coming from here instead, and it's still a div. It's just a styled div. So now that I've done away with that, I can get rid of that import. I can delete this file. Are you sure you want to delete? Yes, I am. Thanks. And we have a right call definition because we are going to be adding another column on this page momentarily. But that was the first thing. So now I have, switched that over. And you can see I've already got definitions set up here for a lot of the things we're going to be doing as we transform some of these other things, as we create content for these new components that we haven't defined yet. I've done a lot of this ahead of time so that it's just already done since we have a limited amount of time. But there's lots of great examples in here for you of how it works. So we've done that. So let's go to to-do number 2. And if we look, let's see, if I go back to here to my search, yeah, it's just this file. Okay, cool. We want to loop to produce multiple available plant components. Okay, so last time we set 3 instances of available plant and we hard coded, I want to go to this test plants and have the one at index 0 and the one at index 1. Well, if you're fetching data from an API, you have no idea how many are coming back. And so this approach is not going to work, right? There's a lot of repeated code, and it depends on you knowing exactly how many there are. So we're going to loop for it instead. And so what we need to do is create a variable const, and I'm just going to say available plants, plural, but with camel case here. And I'm just going to say, I want to go to my test plant since that's my data, and I want to map it. Okay. And the result that comes back will be, equivalent to this, but we're only going to have to define it once. So the first thing I need to do is to make sure that I have both a plant and an index, because I have to set a key on this, as we discussed before. And let me fix this now that I've gotten this all. There we go. Okay, so I've got my anonymous function here that I'm passing in to map as required. I'm making use of the fact that I can access both the element, each plant object that's in this array, and also that index. And now I can actually set things. So I really can just take this because I know this is what I want. And I just have to adjust and say, first of all, I need a key now because there's going to be multiple. I need to have unique keys for each one. And then here, instead of saying test plants, I now have access to this local plant variable here, that's the parameter that's providing me with whichever plant it's on as it's looping through with the map function. So that makes it, and it looks like I have a mistake here. Here we go. So I'm still using, the same component as before, but it's much simpler. I only have to put it in here once now. It can handle any amount of data. I could have 1 plant, I could have 100 plants, and this will work the same every single time. So to place it down here, all we need to do is use a JSX placeholder and just use that constant available plants that now holds that mapped JSX. It has all of the instances of this with the individual unique data from each one in the array. And if we go back to our page, it looks like we have, sometimes when you're in the middle of changing things, let's see. Ooh, it's giving me issues. Okay, give me just a second. Let me see what I did. Oh, I didn't return. I warned you guys about this. This is exactly an easy mistake to make. If you do not actually return it and you have brackets, it has no data to return to you. It will not return that JSX. But if you return it, then every single time it goes through, it adds on, here's another one, one that corresponds to that element. So now when we come back, we see it. And we can, come back in and look at these in the tree here and see exactly what's in that available plant component. It's just that paragraph with all of that text that we set. If you guys recall, right now, yeah, that's all we have is this little p tag with all of this data that we just grabbed from the props that were passed in, from the plant that was passed in. We deconstructed all of those individual keys out of that plant object that was passed in and used them here. So we're seeing the exact same result as we had before, but we looped this time. So this is essential stuff, and you'll be doing some of this tonight for Studio as well, using some data that they make available to you. Okay, so now we've taken care of to-do number 2. Oops, I do not want to delete the entire file. Oh my goodness. There we go. Okay, so the next thing to do, we're going to upgrade the content and available plant so that instead of just having those simple little lines of text, we actually have a really pretty card, and we make use of the images and make it look really nice. And also have a couple little buttons on there. So let's go over to that. We can see here that in available plant, we have that to do right here. Upgrade to display the card with the image, the chevron icons, etc. I will just pull all this together for you. So give me a second here. Okay, so we still are going to have our props here, name, color, image. Oh, none available, but we also need to pull an image. So I'm going to add that. So I have that available to me by name. And then we're going to start out now using some of this. There's a lot of styled stuff in here. It's a combination of divs and spans. The span here is just for some text where I just wanted to have a little bit of a different color and make it uppercase. And these down here are actually going to be applied to some font awesome icons that you may remember I had imported those through the index.html file in the public folder last time, along with my Google fonts. So I'll take care of those with some classes, and that's fine. But I also wanted to add some styling to them, so this will take care of that. And then everything else are divs, so they actually have some structure to them. They're going to inform the layout. I'm using Flexbox. My div already has display flex on it because I defined that in index.css up here. All divs are automatically flex containers. I made sure that was kind of a default. And so now I can go in with my style components and just make other things more specific. Like I want this one to be, in the direction of a row and instead of a column or whatever. So that's how I'm setting all this up. And so I'm going to go ahead and just kind of add this in. And then let's see. How much time do I have? We have a lot to cover. I'm going to go ahead and cut and paste this for the sake of time and just talk you through it, because it's a lot to have to live code. Let's see. Okay. So there's a couple things going on here. One is that we now have a styled plant, and this is coming from the styled components, and it's just a div. So before I might have just done a div here and added a class, and instead I have a styled plant that has the styling right here because of styled components. And but I did give it one more class, actually, because I do have a global class in index.css that defines some additional things that I want to be able to apply in multiple places across my application. So I don't want to do that just in the available plant file. This actually is more global, so I am pulling in that class as well. This is very common, especially if you have a large company that has like their own themes and their own like style. What's the word I'm looking for? That they'll have an entire like library, their own style library with classes that you use and things like that. So this is a way that you might do that in combination with, you know, with style components that is specific to the file you're in. And then I've got my image and text. That's another div, and inside of it is just an image. I'm using for the source of the image, I'm using the image link, that URL that's coming in from the data as part of the props. I've set the alt message to just be the color and the name that come from the props there. And then there's some text here inside a paragraph, and I don't need any fancy styling for this paragraph, so it's just a regular P element. And I'm just saying name, comma, and then color, but I'm capitalizing color. Now, you'll see my page over here has an error, and that's because it's looking for capitalize, and I have not imported that. So if I were to actually, you know, be doing this for the first time, and I was saying, I want to come in and I want to say capitalize, it is not finding it, and that may be because I don't have it. Maybe I did not put my exports on there, or maybe I have to. Yeah, it's just not seeing it. That's okay. So I can come up to the top and actually just import them. So I can say import. And because I have multiple things, there it is. So it sees it now, capitalized from shared utils. So if I add that and then fix this by passing in the color, that part will be happy. And I do still have errors here, but let's see. Oh, yeah. I've got stuff in here that I have not done yet. So that's okay. We'll do this part in just a second. I'm going to take it out for now, and then it'll be happy. That's what happens when I bring my whole solution in all at once, guys. Okay. Okay, hold on. Okay, so little tip for you guys, even though React serves this a lot like Live Server does for vanilla.js applications, every once in a while, you might fix things related to imports, but it doesn't catch up. And it also sometimes, I used to have this problem all the time where if I was typing my imports in at the top, like manually, and I didn't do it quite right, and I paused long enough because I have autosave on and it's like constantly updating, it would kick me off. Like I'd have to reserve the entire application from the terminal every single time. It's something about imports, but it hasn't been doing that to me here. So you can see that it's still served, but I had to actually refresh it in the browser for some reason to get it to fully update. So if that happens to you, maybe you don't still have an error. Maybe you just need to refresh it in the browser. Hot tip. Okay. So we can see now that we've got, you know, that whole image and text, and then we've got this arrow group with these chevrons. Here's the classes that are applied that are particular to Font Awesome. It's a Font Awesome thing. You can look into documentation for that if you'd like. And then I just have a title, which this is just a little thing where you can basically turn any HTML element into a like a tooltip. You can add a tooltip to it that is like not fancy, but the browser automatically adds it if you give it the title attribute. You can do it on just about most things. This is just a span, right? Left chevron is just a span that I styled with styled components. So I just added a title to it. So what happens is you come over here and you hover over it for a second, and boom, you get remove one plant from flower bed and add one plant to flower bed. Little tooltips to tell the user what those buttons are for. Okay, so you can see that there's a lot going on here. I've got my images. Looks like I have an error with my yellow daffodil image. I'll have to look into that. And then I've got the number available. So like all this is nicely formatted now. All the data is coming through dynamically that's represented by each of the different objects. So I have 3 instances of this available plant component, and each one's displaying differently. Now the buttons don't do anything. I can click on them and nothing happens. So that's the next thing that we're going to do. But does anybody have any questions about what I just did? I know it's a lot to look at, so it's okay. You guys will have links to this later if you want to study it some more. This is, you know, what you're seeing here. Something that is you have to get used to if you use styled components is suddenly everything looks like React components, because that's what styled components does, is give you these custom components. But this is actually all just styled components, but you might have a mix sometimes of the two. And you just have to look at your definitions to know, you know, which ones are styled components and which ones might be like components you imported from another file or defined separately. I also want to reiterate, I mentioned this on the slides, but you'll notice that I defined all of these styles outside of my available plant component. Again, that speeds your application up a little bit because it doesn't have to evaluate these every single time it renders this component. So it's good to just do it once. I also will point out something that wasn't on the slides. If you know anything about these pseudo selectors like hover, this is a great shorthand that you can use in styled components, where you basically just use this ampersand to say, for this current style definition for left chevron, when you hover over it, then here's the CSS values to use instead. So I've changed my color. I've added a transform little, you know, scale thing to make it pop up a little bit bigger. And then it automatically manages that for you. So that's just a little tip for you. That kind of stuff can be found in the docs for style components. Madeline, you had a question?
Yeah, and I might have just missed this, but and I'm not sure if it's still super relevant, but in like left chevron where you have class name, what if you wanted to add multiple classes to that? Like that's something I will do to sort of dynamically change things.
Yeah.
What does that look like in?
Yeah, like prior to me using styled components, when I was having to like pull in something from like a module that was like, you know, imported, I used a template literal here instead of single quotes. And then I placed FA and FA chevron circle left. I placed those 2 classes there. And then the third thing that I did in that template literal was a template literal placeholder with a $sign. And that was where I had my logic for, you know, adding the class that required JavaScript. So basically just turn it into a template literal so that you can have the ones that are hard coded and the ones that have logic at the same time.
Okay.
Yep. As it's very common to have multiple classes, and you can have multiple conditions. You can have multiple, you know, template literal placeholders next to each other, handling different expressions and different ternaries and things like that.
And so how would you do that with styled components? Like you would maybe change the type of element that it is, like have a different styled element, styled component, or?
In this case, what I basically did was say for my styling, instead of adding a class here for that, because these classes have everything to do with font awesome and nothing to do with styling. If I had my own styling, then I just handled it up here. That was the point of turning it into left chevron, but it's still a span.
Mhm.
But I just said, apply these CSS definitions to this span. And that's how I did it.
So,
Instead of
so
using,
say, yeah. So say that like at the end of like if there were you couldn't go left anymore, right? And you wanted it to be like grayed out left chevron. Is that how you would handle that? Like,
so you could still have a conditional class. So like, let's say with styled plant, for example, because I have this one here that's a little shorter. Let's,
sure.
if you wanted to have like the card class is always there, but maybe you have some sort of additional class, that does something, you can change this into a template literal and say card. And then next to it, you could, oh, I'm sorry, you can't do this directly. You do have to put it into a JSX placeholder first. There we go. And then you can have a template literal. And you can say, okay, I've got the card class. The next class, which, may or may not exist, I'm just going to put in here so I can have some logic. And I might say like, true question mark, or, because maybe you actually have like an
Sure.
actual Boolean there. You would just say like, is whatever, and then you could have like, something, I don't know, something like, I'm like totally blanking on, other class. Let's just call it other class.
Okay.
So you could basically just say, if this is true, then return the other class. And if you need more than one, if it's an either or, like I showed you on the slide, where it was like green text or red text, then use a ternary expression instead.
Okay.
But for something like this, if it's just a matter of either use this class or don't, then you can just have some Boolean that just evaluates the true or false here, use the double ampersand, and then put the class name. And then if that evaluates the false, this will just be nothing. You might also sometimes see people do it this way, where they ram it right up against it here, and then put the space here instead. It just, you'll see it either way.
Okay.
Depends on the dev, but yeah.
So like in this instance, you'd want the component to be everything about the style that's relatively static, and the class names then is how you handle any dynamic styling. Okay, great. That's really useful.
That would be the recommendation. Yeah. And I may have some more examples of that next time. I have to remember. Yeah, I think I'm going to have at least one example of that next time in this project. So I'm going to put this back the way that it was before. Okay. All right. So let's keep moving forward. That was a great question. Okay. So we've done that part. Now let's add the event handlers. So this is where you say, okay, I've got these things. I want to treat them like buttons, but I want to be able to capture the event when they're clicked. So I need to have these on click, and I need to make sure it's camel case, because this is JSX. And so I'm going to say on click equals, I'm going to use a JSX placeholder, and then I'm going to reference some function. And this one I want to call, handle remove plant. And then I can do the same thing down here and say on click equals placeholder handle allocate plant. Now these don't exist yet, so I have to go define them. But you basically just want to define them pretty much. The convention that the people that I've worked with, a convention has typically been handlers are kind of like one of the last things you do before your return. So I would just put them right here above the return and say, const handle remove plant. And I can, have my little arrow function for that. And I can do the exact same thing for handling allocate, and then we'll just have different results. And of course, eventually we're actually going to make this like really actually do things to make it change things on the page. For today, we're going to console log something because we don't know about state yet, and that's okay. So I'm just going to, you're going to do something similar tonight. I think it's either going to be set up for you to console log or to maybe throw up an alert in the window, but this is kind of how you'll practice it in studio tonight. So we'll just say, you know, whenever I click the one button, we'll say this button will return one, you know, and then it will tell us about the plant because we have that prop available to us. All of these properties out of that plant prop. And then same thing with allocating. So we can come over here and I can switch back over here to the console, which, you know, seems to have all kinds of angry issues. Okay, so now if I click on the button, I click on the left button, it says this button will return one blue hyacinth. If I click on this button, it says this button will allocate one red tulip. And hey, look at that, there's my image. Google must have been having a moment. Okay, so yeah, so my handlers are clearly working because we see this result every time I click. It's detecting the event and then it's running those functions, those handlers, every time it detects the event. And that's all you have to do. So event handling in React is actually very straightforward because you just put it right on the element you want to detect the event on, and then just point at the function you want it to execute. Just remember that you don't call it from here. You typically just will reference it, and then it knows which one to call, and it'll actually execute it once it detects the event. So that's taking care of that, and we'll definitely, that's going to be much more exciting next class when we actually have things that we can track the values of things changing on the page and then make the page update to reflect those changing values. Okay, so let's go over to our thing. We took care of this one, we took care of this one. So now we need to do number 5. We're going to add a right column below, and it's going to contain a flower bed component that's going to show us the plants that we've selected from the list on the left. And so the first thing to remember is that I already created another div style for right column that has the correct calculations on the width. Otherwise, it's pretty much the same as left column. I just want this one to be flexible. So all I have to do is say, I want a right column. Go get me that div. And then I'm going to put some stuff inside of it. And it wants us to have an instance of the flower bed component. So if we go over to flower bed, we can see here that we might have some styles defined already, but I don't actually have any of that code here. It's not returning anything. And we also haven't exported it. Let's go ahead and do the export so that make it easy for it to find it for us. All right, so export default flower bed. And then we could, you know, just for the moment, say return nothing to see here for now, just to prove that it's gonna display on the page, and then we'll actually fill it out in a second. But you know, it's important during development to keep an eye on reality in the browser, right? It's also important to make commits all the time, and I haven't been doing that because it's lecture and I'm in a hurry. But I would have been like committing every time I completed one of these to-dos. That's typically what you want to do. And sometimes even more often than that, depending on how big the to-do is. Okay, so now I can come in here and I could say, I want to go get that flower bed component. Oops, there it is. And it knows where it is now that I have the export statement, so I can do that. It's expecting, it's going to be expecting a prop called selected plants. That's the instruction here. So I'm going to say selected plants. That plants plural means we're going to be, you know, giving it a whole list of plants, a whole array. We're going to be passing down that data. So I'm just going to put an empty array in here for now. And then we're going to test it out with what happens if we actually pass in the test data instead with all of those flowers. So selected plants, I saying this is a prop we need. So I'm definitely going to need to do something with that in the definition. So I'm kind of working both ends against the middle right here, right? And I just realized I've got, let's see. Okay. Okay. I'm going to take sorry. So the props we have right now, our props object has something called selected plants that we're trying to pass in from the other component. So I can access that directly. And so I'm just going to go ahead. I only really need to use it once. I'm going to say const, and I'm just going to say plants equals props dot selected plants. But I'm actually going to make this, let me be really specific. I'm going to make this the JSX. This is not the data anymore. I'm taking the data that's being passed in, props.selected plants, and I'm going to map it to create the data. And I'm going to do it one plant at a time. And that's going to give us the selected plants that we want. The problem with this is that we haven't created a selected plant component is something we also still need to fill out. So for now, I'm just going to say return, you know, something like P, and it's going to yell at me if I don't have a key. So I'll say key is plant.id. Oh my goodness, I used the wrong brackets. Let me fix this. Sorry, guys. Curly braces. There we go. Plant.id. Okay. And then I'm just going to give the name of the plant, maybe plant.name. We'll do something fancier later when we actually fill out this selected plant thing. But for now, we'll just list the name of it for each one and have, you know, a separate paragraph. And that will be our plants JSX. And so here we can actually start returning what we really want to see. So you'll say that we want it to have either text saying that no plants have been allocated or a series of selected plant components, which is what we're eventually going to be doing here. So that means we've got conditions here. But the first thing that I want to do is to actually have my entire styled flower bed from up here, where I'm taking this div that gives us the overall styling for this entire thing. That's my parent div. And then inside of it, I'm going to have a div that just has an H4 in it for a title. It just says my flower bed. We'll just have that at the top no matter what. But then below that is where the conditional stuff comes in. So because I want to use a ternary operator here, I need to have JSX placeholder to handle that logic. So I'm going to say, if the plants JSX is available, then first I want you to give me this plant grid and put in the plant JSX in that plant grid, which is defined right here. And it's just another div that has a way of kind of doing a little flexbox grid. And or we want to say, you know, P and then just something like allocate a plant to get started if there's no plants. And if I like use my formatter, I've got Prettier installed for that. You'll notice that it puts it in this format, and I showed you this on the slide too, where it puts each of the possible returned JSX here. And I have a typo, let me fix this. Each of them in parentheses, but with that colon in between, and that's okay. That's one way to do it where it's a little easier to read because it's not one big long line that's like going way off the edge of the screen or wrapping around or anything. So that's it, one or the other. I do still have a problem that I need to see here. Oh, yeah, we're up to speed on that. I fixed it. Okay, so now we see my flower bed, but we don't see this return information here. So I think that's because of the way that I've done this, where I actually did it based on this. I think what I'd rather do with my logic here is say, rather than checking for the plant JSX, we should really check it for the props.selected plants. Because that's either an empty array or it's an array that's got data, and that's going to evaluate properly to like truthy or falsy. And so then I'm still not seeing it. Okay, that's interesting. Dun, 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 dun. Interesting. Okay, I am not 100% sure. Maybe I still don't have it. Let me go back over to
Did you save the file?
yeah, I've got auto save on. Selected plants equals empty array. So that's correct. I'm passing it. Do I actually have this? Got it imported. Got it exported. Interesting. Yeah, I should be seeing this text, and I'm not sure why I'm not. So let's go take a look at the actual code here and see. Okay, there's the div that I'm looking for. And there's nothing in it. So, oh, no. There is no div below here. Is there supposed to be a div? There's not supposed to be a div. But the text is definitely not there. Okay, so I'm gonna have to figure that out. I mean, I literally have the same thing in my solution as I do here. So I must have made like a really small, it's always small things, guys, always. There's gotta be something real small that's not quite right. But we're running out of time and I wanna keep going. So I'm going to, let's do this. Let's change the input and actually see what happens if I give it test plants. Does it display the, okay, hyacinth tulip daffodil. So it's definitely, the logic is working. I just don't know why it's not displaying this paragraph. Maybe there's something off about the text color and or something. But I will, it shouldn't be, it should be the same color. That's okay. We will keep going forward because ultimately we're going to actually, instead of returning this, we're going to return instances of the selected plant thing. So we've got these little cards that reflect each one and the number that are being allocated at that moment. Which right now I just have hard coded in this data. You know, each one of these has, 2 allocated and 6 allocated. So those are the numbers we'll be seeing. Okay, so we have these parts more or less done. So really we just need to get this last one done here. We're going to go over to selected plant. And first we will get the properties that we need from this. And we can really just do this similarly to the way it's done here, where we're going to take the plant prop that's passed in, because it's the same prop is what we'll be passing in, and grab it. We're just going to need slightly different properties. We're going to need the name. Do we need the name and the color? Yeah, I think so for the image alt. But instead of num available, I actually want num allocated for this one. So that's what I want. And then we'll have the JSX that's going to be returned. So let me go grab that. Now this one only has 2 styled components here. I've got a div that's styled called styled plant card. That's just a container. And then I've got big num that's styled as a span just to apply some extra styling to some text. So here, I did this part. Now we'll do this card. Okay. So I'm going to just return, oops, look at this. I'm going to return the styled plant card. I'm adding on that card that's coming from the global CSS again as an additional class because I already have some things defined there for this. And then I'm inside of that div, I've got an image that is using, some of these props, image source and color and name. And then I've got this big num that's just a span for this text that's just going to have that number, whatever that number is, it's coming in as a prop through the plant prop as part of that object. So I need to export this as a default. And then over in the flower bed, I can now change this out and say, I want this to be the selected plant, but it's coming from selected plant. And so it's gonna, automatically put that import statement up there for me. I need to change my closing tag to be, actually, that's not true. This is self-closing. So I can just, hold on. We're not using anything in between, so I can just do like that, self-closing. Okay. And I give it the key and that's fine, but I do need to pass the plant in. So I'm going to say plant equals and give it plant. And that's of course coming from this plant here. And you'll notice I didn't use an index this time around. That's because I know that I can count on the ID that's in my coming from my plant objects to be unique. Now, if that's not the case, if you can't guarantee that it's going to be unique, then you might want to use something like an index, or what a lot of people really do in the real world is use what's called a UID, a universally unique identifier. UUID, and there's actually a library out there that can generate those for you really quick, and it's like, I don't even remember how many characters, 16 or something, that are like, guaranteed to be, unique. And so that is another option for you if you have a situation like this where you have to prove to React that for sure they are definitely all going to be unique, but maybe your data isn't. There's a possibility you could have the same ID in some of your data. That would be bad, but hopefully coming out of a database that wouldn't happen because the database would make sure that they're all unique. But things to think about in the future, guys. You can worry about that in Unit 3. So now that I've done this, let's go over and take a look. And now we have these beautiful cards. They're displaying that data, and we've got the image, we've got this, if we didn't have the image, we'd have that alt, that would have the name and the color behind there. But everything's here. So really the next thing to do is to make these buttons function in a way that if I click on this number would go back to 7 and this number would go down to 1. And if I click on this, this number would perhaps go to 5 and this number would go up to 3, right? Because we're pulling them back or we're allocating them in either direction. So we want to be able to do that, but to do that, we have to know how to manage state in a React component. So that's something we're going to do in the next class. Who has questions about what I did so far today? Tyler?
This is more like just regarding divs and spans, not necessarily something specific that you did, but in the most recent thing, that big number, you had it identified as a span. Mm-hmm. Could that just be a div as well, or what's the difference between them?
It could be. Div has potentially structural implications. Now, I tend to take care of that in my apps by giving, like, you remember I said I had given it some default, in my global CSS here. I made sure it was a Flux container. I made sure there's no padding, there's no margin by default, that when it calculates things like padding, that it does it properly, which is box sizing border box takes care of that. It's a long story, but that's something you have to do to make sure everything adds up properly. And so if I had not done this, there could be some styling applications, like maybe the div always does have, some sort of margin or padding in it or something. And that would change the way that this text displayed as part of this box. So span is something that has zero styling implications, no structural implications whatsoever. So if you're just doing something that's text, sometimes that's a way to go.
Okay, All right,
Yeah.
thank you.
And I handled the centering of it, like, by actually defining that as part of the container here where I had a line items center. Actually, that's the whole container. It would be in the card definition, I think. If I got the card set up, let's see. Nope. I think I have somewhere I have things centered by default, and that's why it's doing it. All right, I think it is just inheriting it from the entire container, yeah. You can see that kind of stuff down in here, like if you start, messing around with it and getting into it. I don't have it. Let's see if I select it here. Yeah, it doesn't show it, but it's definitely inheriting that from somewhere. Okay, any other questions? Nope. Okay. Yeah, I know we covered a lot of stuff tonight, guys. And I appreciate you sticking with me, and I will get the slides up in a few minutes so that you can, revisit all of this stuff if you want it for reference, and also go look at this code. This branch that you'll want is actually class 19 solution is going to be the branch, and it's already pushed to the repo. Okay, again, I don't have any beginner React exercises available at this time, since this is the first time we're teaching it at this level. Next time I will have one for you that you'll be ready for once you learn about state. So for tonight, or coming down the pike, you've got Thursday, React Part 3. This is our last class of the unit, guys. And then you'll have a catch-up class on Monday, which is the day that all of your graded assignments for Unit 1 must be complete by midnight in order to continue on to Unit 2. So take advantage of office hours, anything you can between now and then. Try to get your demos in and get your answers from your TAs early as possible. If your TAs are not available, go meet up with other TAs when they have office hours. Just do whatever you can to try to get it done as soon as possible so that you're not stressing out against that deadline. Then we'll have a break on the Thursday after that catch-up class, the 17th, and then Unit 2 begins the week after that. It's a very short turnaround, but we're going to jump right into Java. And it'll be good stuff. You guys are going to learn some back-end stuff, and then in Unit 3, you'll be able to put it all together. Okay, so for Studio tonight, you've got a Pinterest style pin that you're going to be developing that's related to the recipe things that you were doing in the last Studio. You'll want to use the starter code that's in Part 2 Studio, and in the instructions here, I actually discovered a couple of mistakes. It tells you here to check out Studio 2 solution. As near as I can tell, that branch does not exist, and the starter code is in main. So you can just go back to main, or maybe you're already in main. That's where you've been coding your solutions. That's fine. So just make sure that you go to Part 2 Studio, though, structurally. That's where the code is. It's a different project. You're going to practice using props. You're going to practice rendering content conditionally, and you're going to practice mapping over data. Make sure you're making frequent git commits as you go. I feel like there was one other thing to point out. Hold on. One other mistake I saw. Somewhere here it tells you that you're going to apply some CSS classes, and they're in app CSS. They're not in app.css. They're in a class, a file called styling.css that will be alongside all of your components. And that's the module that you'll want to import, and then you'll be able to access the classes from there. So yeah, disregard that. And everything else, they take this through you step by step. As usual, they give you, a lot of the code that you need. So just take it a step at a time. And later this evening, I can't promise it's going to be by the end of class, but I will have a review for you up at some point.